Thank you everyone for coming to my presentation. I will be discussing Tibet and some of the struggles the Tibetans have faced from China since it occupied Tibet. But first, I'd like you to imagine something for me. If you could, imagine one of the things you believe most in, be it spiritual, academic, or otherwise. But now, visualize a demanding force that required you to never practice, never talk about, or advertise, teach, or even share these beliefs. Imagine this force required you to attend classes teaching against this belief or your faith. And if you can envision these things, you do have a vague understanding of what life is like for a Tibetan Buddhist. Since the Chinese occupation in 1950, Tibetans have been forced to face oppressive governmental regulations in their cultural identity and their religious practices. China has persecuted Tibet through many means. This presentation will follow first persecution through ethnocultural genocide, or in other words, the destruction of the people and the culture of Tibet. This presentation will also explore the Chinese enforced re-education of Tibetan monks and nuns in their monasteries or nunneries. Since the Chinese occupied Tibet, they have committed ethnocultural genocide against Tibet. By constantly harassing the leaders of Tibet and Tibetans, the people are unable to practice their beliefs without fear from a forced government. Chinese harassment was described by Misra in 2000 as follows. In the post-World War II period, Tibetans have suffered more than any other community in terms of ethnocultural genocide and religio-political suppression by another state whose sovereignty is disputed. Chinese forces killed tens of thousands of Tibetans in less than 3 days while occupying Tibet and gaining control of the territory. And this again is according to Misra in 2000. In addition to the mass massacre of civilians, many citizens of Tibet were evicted from their homes and forced to move in order to make way for the millions of Chinese that would take their place. Inhabiting most of Tibet, the Chinese had gained further control of the country. The population of Tibet was becoming less and less Tibetan, and more and more Chinese moved in. Closer to the time this was taking place, Bradshaw in 1969 described this forced migration as follows. In Tibet, where there were formerly hardly any Chinese, they now constitute about a third of the whole population. In order to gain further control of Tibetans, religious leaders were and still are mandated by the Chinese to go through patriotic re-education. Through this re-education, China attempts to influence these leaders against Tibetan Buddhism, and this is again according to Misra in 2000. Tibetans have absolutely no control over whether or not they attend these classes, and harsh consequences await anyone, be it monk, nun, or the Dalai Lama himself, were he still in Tibet, who declined these classes. After opposing re-education, a Tibetan is accused and prosecuted without trial or defense, and is often locked away for years unheard, and this is according to an article Exile to Government in 2009 published. Re-education takes up much of the time typically spent in meditation and personal enlightenment, preventing religious leaders from learning and therefore teaching according to their beliefs. According to the article New Wave of Repression to Hit Tibet Post-Olympics, published in the Tibetan Review in 2008, Li Ku, a Chinese propaganda head, stated, "We must clean out the monasteries and strengthen the administrative committees. After that, we will absolutely control Tibetans." This is a picture of the Dalai Lama. After the People's Republic of China invaded and occupied Tibet, the Dalai Lama was forced into exile and fled to India. Since his exile, anyone who carries or owns a copy of his picture is subject to arrest and imprisonment. This same is true of the Tibetan flag and other items. Between arrests for owning a picture of a Tibetan leader or flag and the arrest for refusing to participate in re-education, arrests skyrocketed. Due to these arrests of monks, nuns, and common citizens for no other reason other than their own religious beliefs, a concentrated ratio of prisoners developed since the Chinese occupation. In fact, the majority of all political prisoners in all of China are located in Tibet, and this again according to Misra in 2000. While incarcerated, prisoners suffer greatly at the hands of their captors. Religious leaders are beaten and severely abused by the Chinese if they practice their faith while in custody, and this is according to Perloff, published in 2009. Another way the Chinese punish monks and nuns for their religious practices is expulsion from the nunneries and monasteries. The Office of Tibet in 2007 describes how Chinese re-education in Tibetan religious institutions has resulted in extremely high expulsion rates, arrests, and even deaths of practicing monks and nuns, which sometimes include suicides that have taken place where monks and nuns were re-educated. Through this presentation, it is evident that cultural genocide has been committed in Tibet. This has occurred through many means with no remorse. Rampant religious persecution throughout Tibet has been shown to be suffered by all Tibetans. monks, nuns, and the people are prevented from freely and fully practicing their religious beliefs without fear from the government that claims to rule them. Discrimination of the Tibetan people seems it will continue and shows no sign of slowing. The Chinese government's domination of Tibetan religious practices in Tibet can be described only as afflictive. But what will you do now that you're aware of the persecution in Tibet? And this concludes my presentation. But are there any questions?
How long has the persecution in Tibet been happening?
The persecution in Tibet concerning specifically Tibetan Buddhism has been apparent since the Chinese began to occupy Tibet, and again to varying degrees since the 1950s.
Did the Chinese want to eliminate or just take over Tibetans?
From my research, it does appear that China does not want to eliminate Tibetans completely, but they do want to make them more like the Chinese.
How does the rest of the world feel about the struggle in Tibet?
Well, according to Lafreniere, Obama recently addressed the question of Tibet by stating his desire for Tibet to maintain its identity. But he also represented that it was also part of China rather than separate to itself. However, there is a worldwide movement in support of Tibet as a nation free of China, known as the Free Tibet Movement, and anyone can join. But I do encourage you to definitely take a look at it. You can look at this particular movement at www.freetibet.org if you're interested. And again, do you have any other questions for me?
No, ma'am.
All right, well, this does conclude my presentation, and I hope you learned a little bit about Tibet and its struggles.